Parasite Eve is a radical game from a radical time. The dawn of the PlayStation saw the rise of a new titan, as well as the rising popularity of two genres: survival horror and the Japanese role-playing game. While Resident Evil ignited an immediate explosion for the former, the latter is a bit more storied. Although wildly popular in its homeland of the rising sun, the JRPG had to pay its dues before it found a strong footing in the Western world. For years, bargain bins were full of some of the genre's heaviest hitters and greatest games that went virtually unnoticed, but none were as heavy or great as Final Fantasy VII. That's the game that expanded the conventional audience. Although even if it failed, I feel like Pokemon would have just picked up the pieces the next year. It's kind of funny how they worked so hard for so long and then Nintendo comes along and outshines them with a single game. The JRPG has roots planted in many soils, from traditional pen and paper tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons to electric prototypes like Ultima and the Black Onyx. But the sweetest fruit this bonsai tree ever bore is Square, and to a lesser extent Enix. Nearly all the household name JRPGs are their IPs.
The alphabet people.
In 1996, Resi shot survival horror to the top of the charts. In 1997, Final Fantasy VII finally garnered the JRPG the audience it deserves. And in 1998, Square saw an opportunity to capitalize on both markets by synthesizing them into this extraordinary title. So let's magnify deep down into the atomic atmosphere, double helix gameplay, and multicellular scenario of Parasite Eve. I never judge games based solely on the modern standard, but also on the time they came from.
That's fair.
So how does Parasite Eve hold up? Like most games of the era, pre-rendered graphics were selected to double-edge results. Some screens are smooth with high contrast, others are blurry and really pixelated. Character models are blocky, aliased, and sometimes faceless, but the supplemental clarity of cutscenes helps the imagination fill in the blanks. The depth of field is really misleading. Sometimes it's hard to tell where the avatar is in relation to other objects, but as far as PS1 graphics go, it's slightly beyond the bare minimum of reasonable. It's not hard to discern objects or identify set pieces, and by making pre-rendered backdrops longer than a single screen, cameras could perform simple scans, which was a small but welcome improvement over the stillborn shots of Resi. Although direction is pretty void of creativity, most angles are recycled without remorse, like the long shot of a hallway, or the overhead projection, or the 45-degree lens tilt. And instead of starting at the top of the screen and being blinded to what's in front of you, most rooms are entered from the bottom with Aya's back to the player, who could then see all the way down the room. Although this turns out to be irrelevant considering the random encounter is how baddies sneak up on you. Lighting conditions are also a mixed bag. Some screens are well lit with vivid colors and dark corners, others have heavily pixelated textures with visible layers in the shadowing. Most of it is so still and lifeless it resembles a painting, which can be either appealing or distracting, but that can be said about pre-rendered graphics in general. They possess that oil on canvas aesthetic that made for smoother textures than real-time polygonal graphics of that time, but they're still so breathless and lifeless, and they make the character models look photoshopped in and the lighting look comatose. Sound design is a very powerful asset in this game. The variety of music is impressive, with most songs containing catchy melodies and diverse arrangements of high-octane pianos, crunchy guitar distortion, elastic strings, and a spinal cord of steel techno straight out of Metroid Prime. Scored around the mental image of a noir procedural, it sounds like Nine Inch Nails wrote the music to Sin City. While the soundtrack is magnetic on its own, it doesn't fill me with dread when playing the game it's supposed to accompany. This is no more apparent than in the transition from moody ambiance to electro battle anthem. Between the music and the laser light show, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be fighting or dancing. Exploration and combat in RPGs are often divided by barriers, but they didn't have to accentuate that, even if it is a killer jam. The music is dramatic, epic, and occasionally moody, but it's not scary. It doesn't evoke that physical response. Except for this one. The imagery is easily the highlight of this game's atmosphere. From spontaneous combustion to cellular disintegration, from genetically altered babes to Cronenberg monstrosities, from gloomy set design to authentic replicas of Manhattan landmarks, this game is an all-you-can-eat buffet of eye candy. Not surprising, since it was a collaborative project between Japanese game designers and American filmmakers. Square's CGI cutscenes were very cutting edge and revolutionary for their time, and they still maintain their own stylistic appeal, and above all, their gruesome content bleeds through their age. The famous opening scene of people catching fire at an opera is like that scene from Inglourious Bastards. And the people melting into some hive mind gelatinous goo? It's like the end of Neon Genesis.
How disgusting.
The atmosphere of Parasite Eve continues to entice and revolt, despite tech limits. It effortlessly merges the biological horror aesthetic with the tone of a gritty crime drama. However, that's not to say there aren't any holes in the ozone layer. While survival horror is one of the most immersive genres, JRPGs are one of the very least. That's not to say they're not fun or interesting, it just means that I'm very aware that I'm playing a game. Chess-like combat, menu systems, text dialogue, statistics. These staples of the genre yank the player out of a situation, allowing them to pause, think, and plan ahead, which detracts from the immediacy and attention central to a horror game's effect. This clashing polarity leaves me switching back and forth between being scared and playing a game. So the worst enemy of this game's atmosphere is actually the gameplay. As cord-cutting as this issue is, it only spoils the immersion temporarily. When the thrill of battling is gone, it's back to the suspense of exploring. And considering the voice acting of many PS1 games, maybe text was a wise choice. The cutscenes are super disturbing, but they're spread among gameplay whose atmospheres is a bit too tame compared to others, and the constant alternation subtracts from their sum. But I guess that's because this game is an RPG first, and a survival horror second. Parasite Eve is a rare mix of survival horror and JRPG. Let's dissect both separately and then see how they both complement and insult each other. One of the biggest surprises was not just the inclusion of RPG elements, but the lack of early survival horror elements, namely tank controls. How the hell did they pull this off on the original PlayStation? I only played the digital PSN release, so I don't know, but still, goddamn. Although something about the way the characters move is wrong. The distance they go doesn't match with the long strides their legs are taking. I don't know what the technical term for this artifact is, but it's just weird to see. Another notable reduction is puzzles. Other than the occasional locked door or power generator, there's barely any puzzles, which can be overlooked since RPGs don't usually feature them anyway, and they aren't really necessary in this action-paced cop story. Another nice detail wasn't just the accuracy of the science, but the recreation of the setting. Before true crime assumed the duty of video game cartographer, Parasite Eve was pre-rendering some of New York City's most famous landmarks: Carnegie Hall, Central Park, Chinatown, and the Big Apple's hottest tourist spot,
the warehouse world.
It's always a pleasantly novel concept when a game isn't just based on a real location, but painstakingly modeled after it. Most of these locations were linear, which won't bother you after being lost in the park and museum, and it's just interesting that they built a game around these predetermined level designs. The RPG side of the family contributes several chromosomes seldom found in horror games: extensive weapon and armor customization, stationary and mobile NPCs, leveling and experience points, an overworld, and talking. Lots and lots of talking. Seriously, this game is exposition up the ass. Playing it made me realize how remarkably far games have come at relaying the story through gameplay. The main attraction, of course, is the combat system. Within it are some familiar mechanics like the active time bar and mitochondrial mana. The ability to move around normally during a battle adds a layer of defending yourself while waiting to go on the offensive, and it's much more engaging than everyone just standing in one spot hurling attacks at each other. When attacking, a dome representing the weapon range appears, leading players to balance getting close enough to strike with staying far enough to evade. Now this is all fun and interesting, but only if you're already into that type of gameplay. It has several issues like cramped areas of action and wonky movement, and as if random encounters aren't shitty enough, there's no point in even trying to escape because after a single step you're thrust back into the same match. It doesn't seem like a big deal at first, but as the enemies get tougher, it just becomes annoying. I remember the moment I saw this dog, I was like, oh no, they're gonna turn that puppy into a monster and make me kill it like all the others. I have seen The Thing enough to know when some shit like that is being foreshadowed.
All day long, my foot up a dog's ass!
But by this point, I was like, man, fuck this dog.
Cause he just raped me!
RPGs are famous for their excruciating multi-phase boss fights, and from the sewer lizard to that final showdown, Parasite Eve carries this torch.
Grab a dog! Now choke him! and I kick the shit out of him.
So how do these two disparate styles of gaming mesh together? Well, like I said before, the gaming is what penetrates the immersion of the atmosphere, so the marriage doesn't always play out harmoniously. RPGs usually offer a lot of supplies, while survival horror limits resources. There were usually so many medical and ammo pickups at the end of each battle that I was never worried about conservation or running away. Not that I fucking could. But there was some creative thinking on balancing the two. As frustrating as the combat can be, this maneuverable take on action RPG was definitely the smarter direction, because I cannot think of anything less suspenseful than turn-based combat. And with a single player instead of party members, that feeling of helpless isolation remains. Although I can smell the leftovers of Square's impulse to make Danny and Maeda playable. So yeah, survival horror and RPG, let's say they're not very symbiotic. Parasite Eve is just not for everyone. I would recommend Parasite Eve as a horror game for RPG fans, but not the other way around. They would find themselves being scared of nothing more than a deleted save file. There are some RPGs that I adore, and some I find interesting enough to tolerate their frustrating gameplay. But if you didn't play Parasite Eve growing up to the point that the controls are locked into your muscle memory, it's gonna be a whirlwind of good times and bad times.
Chemistry. It is the study of what?
Players that can actually get through the game will be rewarded with a story that puts their high school science knowledge to the test.
Chemicals.
A minor understanding of human genetics and cellular biology is necessary to appreciate both the game's plot and theme, but I'ma dumb it down so good you could learn it through a straw.
Stupid bitch!
Also, the game was designed to be digestible as both a sequel to the book and a revision of it. Kinda like Earthbound was of Mother 1. But even the author said it worked well as a sequel, and it does clear up some details. So I'ma include it in the timeline despite having never read it. I did see the film adaptation though. I just have one question. Is it Aya or Aya? I like Aya cause like Aya Brea, but I feel like it's Aya.
Shut up, science bitch.
The story of Parasite Eve began a long-ass time ago. Before the game, before the book, before the entire history of the world. 2.5 billion years ago, when all life was just single-celled bacteria, mitochondria was its own species. A major step in evolution called endosymbiosis occurred when mitochondria became a part of the cell. Mitochondria provides energy to the cell in the form of oxygen, and the cell returns the favor with minerals and other nutrients. A billion years later, nearly all living organisms on Earth have come to rely on the symbiotic relationship of mitochondria and the cell, and it has been that way ever since. Parasite Eve is based on the hopefully fictional idea that mitochondria is actually a parasite, the dispersed body of an intelligent conscious life form dubbed Eve. Based on the 200,000-year-old maternal ancestor of modern man, mitochondrial Eve, whom the mitochondria even remember inhabiting. Throughout the entire history of life on Earth, mitochondria have been awaiting the hour of their own evolution to overthrow the cell and become the dominant life form. 1.5 billion years later, sometime in the early 20th century, that time had finally come in the evolved mitochondria of a Japanese woman named Kiyomi. And here begin the events of the book. The mitochondria gained control over her mind and body, deliberately causing a fatal car crash. Her kidney was transplanted to a teenage girl named Mariko Anzai, while her liver was snuck away by her grieving husband Toshiaki, from which Eve comes into full being. She obtains a sperm sample from Toshiaki and fertilizes one of her own eggs. She implants the zygote in the womb of Mariko, and an offspring is born in mere moments. Eve anticipates this will be the ultimate being, a life form capable of adapting its genetic code into infinite forms, superseding all eukaryotic organisms. However, the experiment fails due to the sperm containing the paternal Y chromosome, which was to go extinct. The newborn and the mitochondria both succumb to necrosis, and Toshiaki combusts in the throes of its death. While it's unknown if Mariko recalls these events, she eventually marries an American man surnamed Brea, and on November 20th, 1972, bore twin daughters named Maya and Aya, the protagonist of the game. At the age of 5, Eve once again awakens within Maya, and showing zero ingenuity, kills Maya and Mariko in another car crash. Maya's cornea is transplanted into her sister's defective right eye, while her kidney is donated to a young girl named Melissa Pierce. The evolved mitochondria now resides in them both. Over the next 2 decades, Aya was raised by her widowed father, and Melissa was put on immunosuppressive medication to prevent her body from rejecting the organ. This illness was actually the mitochondria trying to break free, and suppressing the immune system inadvertently aided that. In Aya, however, the mitochondria exhibited a typical symbiotic relationship. 20 years later, Aya becomes an NYPD rookie and Melissa an opera singer. Melissa auditions for the joint role of an upcoming opera and concert. She is double cast with another singer named Suzanne. The anxiety leads her to take excess medication and overdose, and the second time she faints, Eve is able to temporarily take full control of her, an opportunity she seizes to set Suzanne's apartment on fire. Melissa learns of her death and feels bad, but is relieved at getting the role. She overdoses again, and Eve visits some old Nazi doctor or something working at the Natural History Museum. They conspire to exterminate humanity and bring about the ultimate being. Eve informs Dr. Clamp about her previous attempt and requests that he creates an artificial sperm without the Y chromosome. And when Aya sees an ad for the concert in the paper, she feels a strange urge to go, and the events of the game are set in motion. Opening night, Christmas Eve. Moments into her 32-bit aria, the mitochondria fully awaken, and Melissa becomes Eve, who has the power to communicate with other nearby mitochondria. Now for a science lesson within a science lesson. Oxygen is the energy that mitochondria provides to the cell, and energy creates heat. Heat and oxygen creates a spark, which is precisely how Eve causes an entire audience of people to spontaneously combust. Everyone except Aya, because she's already hot. After mutating some sewer animals and confusing Aya with a cryptic rant about cells, Eve escapes. Christmas Day. The world wakes up to a Manhattan massacre, and the sole survivor reveals the existence of Eve at a press conference, which is seen by the Japanese scientist Maeda, who catches the next flight out. Aya and her partner, token black guy Daniel Dallas, interview an uncooperative Dr. Clamp who treats them to a 101 lecture on mitochondria. Meanwhile, Eve and her audience both attend the canceled concert. She mobilizes their mitochondria, melting them into a slimy orange mass. After witnessing this, Aya and Eve fight on one of those Central Park horse carriages, and the city is evacuated overnight, but Maeda manages to slip in. Aya, Daniel, and Maeda inexplicably gather together in a Soho apartment. Maeda informs them of a similar incident to this that occurred in Japan, referring to the events of the book. Eve attacks the police station to slow them down, but that just leads them to her in the hospital, where they discover her plot to birth the ultimate being and wipe out humanity. She escapes to the museum, where they find she's already artificially inseminated herself, and relieves Dr. Clamp of his duties. She summons the mitochondrial mass to cocoon her as she gives birth on the Statue of Liberty. Likewise, the military summons Aya as she is the only one that can get in the damn robot without melting. She kills Eve and the collective consciousness of mitochondria once and for all on the ruins of the statue. Then, in a totally uncalled for anticlimactic twist, the ultimate being is born anyway, and it takes an aircraft carrier to blow it up. Just an excuse for a final boss. Then, in an even more ridiculous twist, Aya fights another Eve cultured from Maya's liver stolen by Dr. Clamp while he worked at the hospital she died at. Just an excuse for a hard mode endgame. Let's just presume the only thing that happened on day 6, after that last boss fight, was the gang attending the reopening of the opera, where Aya somehow causes everyone's eyes to glow red.
What the? Huh?
It's as confusing as it is interesting. Characters pop off the screen in that signature RPG flair. Monsters have their own clarification. They're all animals mutated by mitochondria. And it's an overall compelling premise stuffed with philosophical implications. Even if you don't understand the science, you can still understand the themes the science is meant to support. What with Aya's personal struggle and anti-gun rhetoric, this game isn't shy about the fact that it has things to say. So what is this story really about?
Chemicals.
What am I, nerd scientist here?
The clue is hidden in Maeda's closing speech. Humans are essentially parasites, and the Earth is our host.
Human beings
are just a very complicated form of bacteria.
Think of the atom. The atom is the smallest unit of matter in the universe. It's composed of a nucleus and orbited by electrons. Doesn't that look familiar?
Your science is a lie.
Humans are living organisms, but we're also a host to other living organisms like E. coli. The planet is a living organism, but it's also a host to other life forms like humans. Everything in the universe, possibly even the universe itself, is just a small part of something bigger.
Whoa. Chemistry is the study of matter.
The relationship between mitochondria and the cell mirrors the relationship between humans and the planet.
But I prefer to see it as the study of change.
So the next step in evolution is not to overcome the host, but coexist with it, like a cellular level symbiosis. And I think that's what that ambiguous ending was about. Recall the microscope scene. Unlike the blue hostile mitochondria, Aya's appears in red, the same red that saturates her iris and spreads to everyone else. Humanity has just taken its next step in evolution.
We're so high right now.
So that's Parasite Eve. I didn't include the sequels because despite the second one being more survival horror oriented, it's a joyless Resi 2 clone with a paper-thin atmosphere and trifling story development. And the third is just a completely different game with the IP skinned around at the last second. Any survival horror fans owe it to themselves to play this game once, or at least just watch this video. But I can't hold it against itself. Square Enix is a creator of JRPGs. That's what they do. Parasite Eve isn't really a survival horror game. It's a JRPG with a horror theme surrogating the typical fantasy and steampunk themes. So if you love JPEGs, rave music, body horror, legs, cop flicks, and hard sci-fi, play Parasite Eve. Or just watch Blade Runner.
Same thing.